My special guest today is Lisa Forrest with Live Oak Bank on the Getting the Deal Done podcast. Lisa has been a regular. I don't know how many dozens of times she's been on.
A
Well,
lot.
maybe not dozens, but I do know that 2 years ago we did her annual update on SBA and other acquisition loans 4 times because the SBA kept changing the playing field and the rules on all the bankers around. So, welcome, Lisa.
Thanks for having me, John. Really appreciate it. And we've known each other for 25 years now, I think.
Something like
So
that.
it's been a pleasure on my part. Thank you.
Yeah, same here. Enjoy your company and Mike's company. So, uh, well, let's get into it because we got a lot to cover, and we like to keep it brief so people can, do it on their way to and from the office or on the treadmill, whatever. But we're going to talk about some of the new rules with the SBA. You're going to talk about what buyers can do to improve their chances of getting a loan and things you want to see from sellers. But let's start out with SBA changes. I think we're going to talk about three of them, right?
Yes, let's do that. And as John was alluding to, there were big changes that came out in 2023 and from the SBA, Small Business Administration, and it really took all lenders, sellers, buyers, brokers well over a year to figure out what they thought about the changes. And then, as also John alluded to, the SBA kept kind of clarifying them over about a full year's period of time because they were pretty sweeping. Now that we're, 2 years later into this, I thought I'd pick out three. John and I talked about which ones to key in on, and I think these are the ones that I think might be the most interesting for your audience. So let's talk about equity. So SBA does require a minimum of 10% down by the buyer in cash. However, the makeup of that equity has a lot more generous opportunities by the SBA. And this is going to be lender to lender on how the lender feels about the changes, but SBA actually is allowing the seller note to count for up to 10% of that equity contribution if it is on full standby for 2 years. And then if it's on and when I mean by standby, no interest, principal and interest payments being paid to the seller on that seller note. If that's the case, then even up to 100% of your down payment can be covered by the seller note. Now, I'm here just to explain to you that that's the SBA rule. At Live Oak, we're not actually doing that, and there's not a lot of lenders that are really doing a full 100% to be covered by the SBA or by the seller's note. Now, maybe for an inside buyer, a key manager, someone with extreme industry experience, maybe we might do 5% down and 5% on no principal and interest, but that's going to be in a rare case for us. It's going to be lender to lender, and we really want a balanced cap stack. So we really are, in most cases, looking for at least 10% to come from the buyer. But if debt service coverage metrics and hurdles might require actually more than 10% down to make the deal pencil from a debt service perspective. But that's one of the changes that's been really talked about.
And I wouldn't want to work with a buyer who said, well, I want to come in for 3 to 5%. I tell them, don't even think about the 10%. Plan on putting in more to control your debt coverage ratio.
That's at least our perspective, and this speaking for this banker, so me, that's generally been my approach for 30 going on 38 years.
Yeah.
SBA is already a highly leveraged transaction, and then to even think about leveraging it even more, I guess I've just seen all the sort of the bad things that happen there.
Okay. What's next?
So let's talk about partial buy-in or rollover equity. So that was a really big shift for SBA. And now you do not have to buy 100% of the company. That used to be the case for decades. Now you have two ways to buy part of the company where the seller can retain ownership. Either a partial buy-in via a stock sale, where say you're buying into their company via stock sale. Maybe you're going to buy 90% of the company and the seller is going to retain 10% ownership in their corporation. And you might want to do it via stock sale if there's some licensing or something that's held by the company, and having the seller roll, or in this case, retain, allows you then to use that license go forward. So that's one case where we're seeing the retained ownership via a stock sale. SBA then just recently actually clarified that you can do this kind of multi-step change rollover with an asset purchase. And so now you can buy the company in an asset vehicle, and the seller can then buy into your company go forward, and that allows the seller to stay involved in cases where you think it makes sense. Having the seller stay on longer than a sort of a year long or up to a year long transition isn't going to be for every situation. So you're going to want to think really hard and long about when having the seller stay on for longer than a transition period is going to make sense.
Yeah, I've seen it work both ways where some sellers said, I'm sick of managing, I want to sell or design, and it's worked, and others who just couldn't stand working for someone else. And after stay 10, 20, 30, 40 years of working on their own. Yeah.
Right, you're going to have those cultural changes, and sometimes it works beautifully, and then there's some cases where maybe the seller, you're doing 100% buyout and having the seller exit within a year is just going to be the better structure. But when you have patents or licenses, sometimes that kind of partial change of ownership can be really helpful.
So what's the third one?
So the third one to talk about today is the $5 million lending limit. I think people on that tune into your podcast are aware that the SBA has a lending limit of $5 million. It used to be per guarantor. They've changed that such that if you have a different NAICS code that now you'd like to expand into, you have another $5 million of lending limit per NAICS code. So let's say you bought into an HVAC industry, you did multiple acquisitions, and you've used up your $5 million of loan limit in HVAC, and then you've integrated all of that well, you've transitioned it well, and you're really ready for your next transition. And then maybe your idea now is, oh, what if I bought a managed service provider that catered to HVAC companies? So now MSP is a different NAICS code from HVAC. So the SBA is now allowing another $5 million of guarantee loan amount available to you because now you're choosing to go into a different industry. Now, and we're actually lending multiple dollars in different industries now, but we're doing it in very thoughtful situations. You really want to have integrated and transitioned in your existing NAICS code very, very well. So this is not for you to do a $5 million loan in HVAC and a $5 million loan in MSP, buying in two different industries, two different companies at the same time. That's not at least what we're doing. So we want to be real thoughtful of when you're sort of ready for that next $5 million worth of exposure.
Okay. Well, those are some big changes. I'm sure there'll be more next year, not sooner. So let's talk about what can buyers do when they come to a bank, your bank, any bank, to put themselves in a better position to get a loan. And let's talk about it from the perspective of a good bank and good bankers, because we know there are people who just lend for the sake of lending, and uh, that's not what the banks I like to work with do.
Yeah, well, so having said all of that, I think as a buyer, one, I'll just say, and I know, John, you can corroborate this, right now in today's environment in lower middle market, there are a lot of buyers. I don't think we've seen as many buyers ever as we have in the last, 1 to 2 years, certainly currently, where the sell side is really inundated with requests for SIMs, and just the momentum around business acquisition is at a height that I've never seen. So you have to be aware as a buyer that you have a lot of competition, and there are literally a lot of buyers. It's not just the broker, the sell side investment banker saying there's 50 other people that have already looked at this transaction. There probably really are 50, if not 100 or 200 people inquiring on each business. So you've got to be ready. You've got to have your, personal financial statements ready. You've got to have your resumes ready. You've got to have your funding sources lined up. And when you're coming to, and that's before you can even talk to a seller, you've got to be ready. When you're coming to the bank, typically what I like to see is if you're coming to us pre-LOI, you're trying to get a sense of whether this is sort of a doable deal for the bank and for you. I like to have an executive summary template prepared. I want to see that you've done a cash flow model. I want to know that you have considered some of the qualitative aspects. So I want that identified in an executive summary so that I can help you think about the transaction. If you come to your lender with just the broker sim and you say, read this 75-page broker sim and tell me what you think about the deal, that's not a really good way to present yourself. I really want you to have an opinion. I want you to have a point of view, and I want you to be able to articulate it. We might disagree. We might have difference of opinions, but you need to be able to articulate what you're thinking first so that we can have a conversation about what we both think and why, especially around the qualitative aspects. It's not just about debt service coverage. It's about customer concentration, dependencies on the seller. What do you think about the industry? So a lot more than just the spreadsheet has to be considered.
Yeah. So let's back up a little. You said there's more buyers than ever. Uh, I heard 30 years ago from multiple sources, the word was always 90% of people, individuals, who say they're going to buy a business never do. There's a lot of them out there. What do you how robust is the market if you're talking serious and qualified buyers?
So right now, I think that with the job market where it's at, I think the idea of getting a W-2 job right now at the wage that you're looking for is compressed. So I do think there are a lot of buyers kind of enamored with the idea of
Mhm.
business acquisition because maybe the kind of W-2 job prospect isn't as interesting to them. So to your point, I'll just say what we're looking for. We're looking for a resume that is transferable. So if you have maybe 1 year as a private equity analyst or 1 year as an analyst in investment banking, and you want to buy a $5 million manufacturing facility, for me, that's not going to be enough transferable skill. You have to have a resume that shows that you have managed people, you've led teams, you have to have the ability to actually operate these lower middle market companies. And I think for some people, it might sound more romantic than it really is. And John, I think you and I just guarantee people it is a lot harder to run these smaller companies than I think people give it credit for. So to your point, I think there's a lot more people now that might be really curious about it or interested in it versus those that are really going to acquire.
Yeah. Well, you sound a little bit like me when I say a qualified buyer has, to some varying degree, managed people, processes, money, and enthusiasm. And then they have to have the money and those skills for the size company they're buying.
Right.
Having been a manager of a deli doesn't make you qualified because you inherited a bunch of money to run, you know, 10 locations of a restaurant or one location of a service business.
And you and I have very, very similar opinions on that topic. Yeah,
Yeah.
your resume and your personal financial statement have to translate for the industry, how the company's organized, and then the size of the company. You know, I'll just say quite a few of our deals, we do have buyers bringing in outside investors to help kind of bridge some equity check, but we're still looking for our operator, our guarantor, to have significant equity into the transaction. If you're bringing investors into bridge equity gap, that could be very interesting, but we want our guarantor operator to still have, a significant investment.
Also known as skin in the game.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's always fun to hear about what people do wrong. Talk about some mistakes buyers have made uh, with you, with the deal, that kind of thing.
And I kind of alluded to some of that in a couple of comments earlier, but I think it's the qualitative things that buyers especially if they're just starting to search for companies and look at companies, that they sort of align on the spreadsheet part of it, the debt service coverage
Yeah.
part of it, which is a little easier to get at because that's the math. So once you kind of wade through the ad backs, which ad backs you're going to take or not take, it's kind of the math. And so that's easier than customer concentration, dependency on the seller. Maybe there's one key employee that really runs the show. Those are the kinds of hockey stick growth where it only debt services in the last full year and by a really large margin. And maybe not being um, sort of as honest with yourself about the skill set you have to run that particular company. So I think the mistakes I see, at least early on, are, bypassing the qualitative aspect of the deal and or just steamrolling right over the red flags and just, you fall in love with the deal and you're going to close this regardless of, X, Y, and Z red flag that's pretty obvious to those of us that might have been doing this for a while.
Yeah, I agree. Uh, I think that and I look at the deals we've worked on when a buyer hasn't done well, it's a couple times have been they just didn't recognize that they wanted the seller to stay on longer than normal transition, and it hurt them. Or
Mm,
they were so into the one thing they were good at in their job, in their career, marketing, numbers. They didn't pay attention to the other things. You got to be well-rounded. I'll just share one of my longtime clients. He came out of Accenture and in strategy at Microsoft, and he has done very, very well over the years. But I remember he was a few months in, and I said, "How are you doing with it?" And he said, "I'm overwhelmed."
mm.
He says, and it's good overwhelmed, but he says, I didn't realize when you own a small business, you have to know how everything works, what happens when it breaks, who's responsible for it, who you call, what it looks like if it's done right. He said at Microsoft, if the copier broke, you made a phone call and another department handled it. Now it's
Yeah,
my money.
yeah, exactly. And I'll just add kind of two more points on there. And I think one, just maybe not understanding the importance of the cultural fit. And I know sometimes as a buyer, you're not necessarily able to get in front of the customers or the employees. I know sometimes the sellers, just for privacy reasons, they don't want you in there. But um, glossing over, will I fit in with the employees? Could I actually see myself interacting with these customers? Could I see myself sitting in an office in a warehouse? Does that culturally fit for me? And can I see myself doing that? And then also, sometimes I see sometimes I see where the buyers might not give enough respect, may not be the right word, to what the sellers have done, where they kind of downplay that the seller has owned and operated and grown this company sometimes from scratch, and they've had it for the last 30 or 40 years. And you've got to give good credit to what the seller's done. And to your point, John, how difficult it is really to run these companies. So you might want to add digitization to it. You might want to add technology to something, but it's not that easy.
Yeah, I'll go back to what you said about the customers and the employees, and I tell clients if it's B2B, and they won't let you do a blind call to clients, customer satisfaction survey, reference check, you have a huge red flag. Because I think of a deal many years ago where I told the buyer, uh, I put this deal on hold if they won't let you talk to the top customers. The attorney was a little more direct. He said, kill the deal. And
Mhm.
the buyer said, oh no, I understand their concern, why no one should talk to them. Bad mistake. Top customer 25% was walking. And same thing with employees. If you have key people, you have to meet them, not necessarily the rank and file, but if there's a management staff and they will that it may be the last thing in due diligence, but a buyer has to be able to talk to them. And a seller should recognize that they have to get along with their employees, and they because all those sellers want the employees to stay and keep their jobs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know it's tough. because every deal's a little different. And I know that there are a good handful of transactions we look at where the seller is just adamant and they're not going to allow any of that interaction to go forth. And you've got a real, as a buyer, you've got a real big decision on your hands.
So you've covered our last point pretty well about what sellers should do. Uh,
Yeah.
you've talked about owner dependency,
Hmm.
key employee dependency, and uh, what else? What else could sellers do to make the buyer's life, a good buyer's life, easier? Because you don't want to sell to a bad buyer because the good buyers walk away, and people like you lending the money. What will make those two happier?
I'd say good exit planning. And I would say read your Tuesday blog every Tuesday because you have great nuggets in there every single week about this. But have some exit planning. Make sure your financials are clean. Clean up really kind of overwhelming ad backs that are going to be scrutinized. So you might as well take some time to kind of take those out of the mix. If you can order a Q of E or a quality of earnings report upfront, or some kind of audit, because your buyer in this day and age, a lot of buyers are requiring quality of earnings reports that they're going to pay for. So if you can do some sort of financial auditing upfront yourself, clean a lot of stuff up. If you can have even a business valuation done ahead of time just to sort of manage your own expectations, I think that would probably be helpful, because the buyers aren't here to really, hurt your feelings about what your company is worth. But at the end of the day, the buyers are really looking at, they are looking at the spreadsheets of the thing. And so the financials and having those clean upfront is going to be really helpful. Delegate as many functions as you can. If you're doing the estimating, the sales, and the floor management, that's going to be really tough from a financing standpoint. And then I would just say, and I know, John, you counsel your sellers on this all the time, just have some patience. You're a lot of times you're a first-time seller, but also you're probably selling to a first-time buyer and they're wanting to make sure they get their diligence right. And so just have patience around all the stuff that their bank is going to ask. And I would also say maybe have a little be ready for seller notes. Be ready for some of those structuring elements that the bank is probably really going to want, and the buyer, things around seller notes and escrow holdback may be a good structuring for your particular transaction. So maybe just have be ready for some of the structuring that might come your way as well, and have a really good exit advisor like John and Jessica.
That's really a lot of good common sense there. We could probably do a whole session on ad backs and stupid ad backs and all of that. I'm just going to close my part by saying the last three clients we worked for on the south side, the two we have now, and the two or three in the queue, no personal expenses run through the business. The worst we've had, I won't say it shouldn't be worse. The most we've had are overfunded pensions and adjusting salary to market. That's it.
Can tell you from a lender perspective, when your buyer comes to present the opportunity to the bank and it's clean and easy like that, I tell you, it goes a lot smoother.
Yeah. Any final comments, thoughts, words of wisdom, Lisa?
Oh boy, you might have come to the wrong place for that. I'll just say that
Oh, you've run out of them because you've been a lot of words of wisdom so far.
I would say in my kind of 38 years of doing this, this is the most brisk start to the year I've ever had. January and February, normally you're kind of maybe easing into the year with signed LOIs and actual live deals that are coming to the table with signed LOIs. This is the most brisk volume we've had in years ever. I will say ever. And so I think that just speaks to the the sellers that need to sell, right? I mean, our aging baby boomers do need to sell, and we've got so many buyers. We've got plenty of buyers, and it is coming together with really nice transactions.
Okay.
So there are really still really, really good transactions getting done.
One thing we didn't talk about here, I know you have some criteria, you and the Live Oak Bank, on things you're going to say no right away. what are those?
So around industries, we are not a lender that's lending into like cyclical industries, kind of think oil and gas, ties to ground up new construction, new build for residential or commercial. I know that could be great opportunity for certain buyers with certain skill set, just a little too cyclical with ebbs and flows. It's just a risk we don't want to take. So new build, we're kind of limiting new build to maybe 20 to 30% of the revenue. So if you've got an HVAC company that's primarily repair and maintenance, but they might have maybe 20% HVAC they're putting into new build, that looks good for us. If it's switched, not so great. I would say that at least for us as a lender, e-commerce just hasn't been a niche that has performed terribly well for us. Trucking and logistics can have a tendency to have a lot of customer concentration. And then we're not real good lenders for like gas station and C-store where you've got a lot of cash kind of coming in and out of the company. Just not a good lend for us. And then also, I know this is a little controversial, but landscaping has a tendency to be a really inconsistent performer in our portfolio. Residential landscaping, just low barriers to entry. The labor market can be a little inconsistent, and it interestingly enough ties to the seller. The relationships of the seller have keyed in really very prominently. So landscaping has just been one that we're kind of shying away from.
Okay. And
Um,
what about customer concentration? Do you have any guidelines, or is it just, you know, is it 20% across the board, or is it, yeah, this is okay at 20 because it's no one else more than two, or how do you look
yeah.
at that?
So I would say for us, a concentration is when if you've got a 10% customer, 10% concentration, that would be considered a concentration for us. Anything that's a 20% customer or above, we're going to do a downside analysis around that gross profit. We're going to say, okay, if you lost this customer, could you still pay us back? You're probably not paying your seller note anymore because you just don't have enough margin. You've got to replace that customer, but 20% or more, we're going to do a downside analysis. So depending on the pricing, I would say generally anything 30% or more customer probably isn't going to debt service with a downside analysis, but we're going to do that at anything that's 20% or more. And we look at, what are the top three
Yeah.
generally.
Okay. That's truly words of wisdom, Lisa.
Good.
So, well,
Glad to
thank
hear.
you for being here. I really appreciate it. Again, this is Lisa Forrest with Live Oak Bank. You can reach her how? How can we reach you?
Yeah, just send me an email, lisa.forrest with two R's at liveoak.bank.
Okay. So again, the Getting the Deal Done podcast with our regular guest and always informative, Lisa Forrest. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, John. Bye now.